Hi everybody. So in this video I would like to share with you the differences between type 1 and type 2 Tarot de Marseille. Before we go into the differences of type 1 and type 2, I think it may be useful for me to clarify what my understanding of Tarot de Marseille is based on the various things that I've read so far about it. So my understanding of Tarot de Marseille is that it isn't necessarily referring to the origin of the deck, but it is specifically referring to a pattern of minors and of major, of the trumps and of the pips. From my understanding, the term Tarot de Marseille sort of stuck with us because in 1930, someone called Paul Marteau inherited the Grimaud publishing house in France and decided to reproduce what we now know as the convert deck, which here I am using the restoration by Christophe Ponchet over here as my convert deck, and he named it the Ancient Tarot of Marseille, I suppose because the convert was published and printed and originated from Marseille. And so subsequently after that, all these kind of decks that we see now that we call Tarot de Marseille, including these ones which weren't from Marseille, we call Tarot de Marseille, and we've accepted that when we say TDM or Marseille Tarot, we really are talking about the patterns rather than the origin. And so, for example, speaking of origin, this one here, the Noblette, which has been agreed as the earliest form of this particular pattern we now know as the Marseille, is actually from Paris, circa 1650. And then the Dordalle is actually from Lyon, circa 1701. And the Païen here is actually from Avignon, from around 1713. So none of these are from Marseille. Converse predecessor or converse template or foundation is this one here, the Chanson from 1736. Somebody argued that the Chanson actually was from the late 1600s, earlier than this current date. This is actually the date of a registration of the wrapping paper that Francois Chanson submitted is dated 1736. But this one here, which is a foundation of the convert, and the convert is the foundation of a lot of our modern TDM, a lot of our modern Marseille decks. This is from Marseille as well. So these two are from Marseille. And so that is my understanding of Tarot de Marseille. They're not origin of the deck, but they are patterns. So not all pip decks are Tarot de Marseille, and not all Tarot de Marseille are actually from Marseille. So now we go into type 1 and type 2. So if type 1 here, seemingly in the first instance, is an earlier stages of the evolution of Tarot de Marseille, initially starting as a type 1 and then they evolve into a type 2. Later on, it was observed that there is a type 2 called the Madenier, which I do not have with me, but I actually do have in my collection. In fact, it is one of my, in fact, it was one, no, it was not one, but it was the first deck I purchased from Yves Renaud, from this range here, from Tarot Heritage, Tarot de Marseille Heritage.com, and I have it somewhere and I can't dig it out without, making a mission out of it. And so that particular Madenier has a pattern that is consistent with the type 2, not the type 1, the type 2. However, interestingly, it has been dated to the early 1700s, so it sits around here. I think it's 1709 or 1710. So the Dordalle is 1701. So in this timeline here, the Madenier sits here. And this one here actually sits right there. I just don't have enough space here, so let me move this here a little bit. Right. So as you can see, 1713, 1736, approximately 20 years, approximately a generation between the païen and the chanson. There are other decks in between, I believe, but these are the sort of the landmark decks, really, from one development to another. And so the Madenier sits here, which means that there's an overlap in the early 1700s between type 1 and type 2. So it really sits like so, like that. If the Madenier were to sit here, which I don't have at the moment, it would be sitting right there, actually, like so, in terms of timeline. And so there is, let's pretend this is the Madenier over here. And so really, type 1 did not really evolve into type 2, but type 1 really, in a way, exists concurrently with type 2. And as these things go, a lot of the times cultural artifacts are organic. They're influencing one culture to another. They're assimilated into one culture and another, and from one culture to the other, I mean. Similar with language, with food, with religious customs, with cultural customs, with clothing, dressing, with architectures, with artistic styles, with a variety of cultural artifacts. Everything is really organic, and they spread all over the world, not necessarily in a systematic fashion. And so that's the second, the first point is that type 1 and type 2 actually overlaps. They're not one after the other. And the second note about the type 1 and type 2 is that it is a terminology that was coined by a playing card historian whose name is Thierry de Police. And if you have tarot history books, you'll see this name before. And so it's not the only terminology or categorization out there, but it is one that he proposed, that came from his framework, type 1 and type 2. So now let's go into the comparison between type 1 and type 2. So this one here is from the païen, and I will use this as a stand-in for type 1. Although the noblette is the beginning or the earliest form of type 1, I think the païen perhaps is a more established, shows a more established pattern in terms of what we commonly understood or understand as type 1. So I'll use the païen instead. I'll bring in the noblette from time to time just to give you a comparison, and I will use the convert as a stand-in for type 2. This particular convert reconstructed or restored by Christophe Ponchet. So I will use this one here. So the first to note, the differences is the Fool. So we'll take a look at the Fool here. In type 1 it's called Le Fool, and in type 2 it's called Le Mat. So the left is from païen, from Avignon, and the other on the right is from Marseille, and it's convert, which is the foundation of our modern Tarot de Marseille. Now to take a look for reference purposes, let's take a look at the noblette from 1650 from Paris, and this is the famous exposed Fool here. So I'll put that aside. And then the Emperor. The Emperor has a Arabic numeral 4 floating in front of it, or in front of him, or his face, and in type 2 you don't. Interestingly though, in the early stages of type 1, as shown in the noblette, you don't see that number, and the Emperor is facing the opposite direction. So I believe this is a facsimile of the original noblette from the museum, this one here. from the National Library of France. So if someone would like to comment on that directionality and the absence of the number 4 in front of the emperor, please feel free. The third differences between type 1 and type 2. Again, the left is from Avignon, païen from Avignon. The right, type 2, as an example of type 2, is the convert from Marseille. Look at his staff. The one on the left is very different from the right. The type 2 has a triple cross, and on the left is very unclear. So let's go to the noblesse from Paris in mid 1600s there. That's a staff. It's that the shepherd staff with the curved, with the hooked tip there, like the staff of a shepherd. And on the right, type 2, you have the triple cross. Now the lovers. The lovers here on the left, the Cupid has a blindfold, and on the right, the type 2, Cupid does not. The blindfold on Cupid have been discussed as depicting a human internal aspect of human state of being that is out of control, like fortune and fortuna, and justice often blindfolded as well, because justice and the wheel of fortune are forces that is often beyond human control. And I think Cupid have been likened to such forces where it doesn't discern who it targets or who it, the passion and love can strike anybody. It doesn't discriminate. So on the right in type 2 here, it looks like Cupid does discriminate. So that's interesting. Chariot. The top there, you see the scallop curtain, whatever this is, along the top of the chariot, while in type 2 you see something different, more of a curtain-like. Also, the shield here in type 1 is often blank, while in type 2 it's always filled. And from my understanding, these type 1 and type 2 is across the board. So all type 2 have these characteristics, and all type 1 have these characteristics. Otherwise, they would not have been able to fulfill a categorization, I suppose. And so in type 1, in the Hanged Man, here you have the tongue sticking out and what looks like fingers sticking out from his shoulders. And on the right, he does not. And he seems more composed on the right, a little bit more in charge, while on the left, he looks a bit funny and comical, but also a little bit, for me, a little bit unsettling, because my mind goes to what happened when someone's hung. Their tongue tends to stick out, and it's quite gruesome, really. The Devil, type 1 on the left, type 2 on the right. Once again, on the left is the païen from Avignon, 1713, and on the right is convert from Marseille. The convert is the basis of our modern Tarot de Marseille, and the left, the païen, is an example of a more established pattern, type 1. There's a face on its belly. In type 2, there's no face on its belly. Type 1, the moon is frontal, facing us directly. In type 2, the moon is profile. Now we come to the world. In type 1, it has been argued that that's Jesus in the middle, and the 4 evangelists, or the beasts of the evangelist, Luke, Mark, John, and Pete. What's that? Luke, Mark, John, and what's the other one? Oh my God. Paul, is that right? Johannes, Paulus, Marcus, and Matthäus. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Sorry guys, my Bible knowledge isn't the best. On the right, the figure is clearly more feminine, with a shawl across her body with bosoms, and on the left there, the figure is more masculine with a cape with what looks like a leafy covering around its waist, and he is carrying what looks like a sword in something else. And on the right, she's carrying like a baton, like a stick. Not a stick, but you know what I mean. So let's take a look at the noble and see what happens there. Remember, the noble is the earliest pattern that is categorized as pattern type 1. We see here somebody argue that could be a very stocky woman, but I would be more inclined to think that that's as a man, and what looks like a breast there are actually an attempt to depict a very well developed pectoral muscles. Is that pectoral? Pecs? Yeah. You know, if you think of bodybuilders, and so you see this one here, I would want to say it's a scepter. It has that bulb and it has the little cross at the tip, very much like the emperor. Let's take a look at the emperor. A scepter like that. So I'm thinking that man in the middle with the cape and with the leaf around his waist, he has long hair, but men throughout the ages kept their hair long. So for me, the length of the hair is no indication of gender. Whether you're bare-chested or not is no indication of gender either. But the lack of waist and the sort of upper body muscles over there, as well as the four beasts of the evangelist around here, Matthäus, Marcus, Johannes, Lucas, that's how we say them in Indonesian, and I'm always having trouble translating them and remembering them in English, is a male figure of authority. And of course in type 2, she is more perhaps Sophia, perhaps, I don't know, maybe prudence, because that's the missing virtue, but it's definitely more female than male. Again, let me see. So we have also this one here, which is the Knight of Staffs here. In type 1, he is called Chevalier, which I think can be translated to knight. Is that correct? And in the type 2, he is Cavalier, or the rider, rather than the knight. Is that correct? French-speaking people, please feel free to correct me. So here we have Cavalier. Here in type 1 we have Chevalier. Feel free to correct my pronunciation and my understanding of the two words, but those are the other differences that is consistent between all decks considered to be type 1 and all decks considered type 2. Somebody mentioned the tower. Now the tower isn't mentioned in in what I read so far. Maybe because the differences in the tower perhaps isn't consistent across the two types. I don't know. But if you look at the type 1 there, it's a unidirectional flame from the sky, while the right there in type 2, the flame seems to be multi-directional. I really don't know if this is just a difference between some of the cards or some of the tower cards between type 1 and type 2. And they're not mentioned in the literature that I've read so far, maybe because they're not consistent. These differences, in terms of the flames and whatnot, probably not consistent across all of the types. So those are the differences between type 1 and type 2. And I'll talk a bit more about the history or the progression, like a snapshot of history of the evolution of tarot. I've been meaning to do that for a while now, but time and resources and filming space have been a bit difficult lately. So when I do come to it, I will definitely come back with that. Until then, I'll talk to you later. Bye.